Hello friends, my name's Emile and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Today we're taking a look at some SUVs and trucks, so let's jump into it. The first vehicle of today, which is the Mercedes-Benz G65 AMG, 603 horsepower, 5,688 pounds of weight. The G-Class is the most powerful vehicle here today, by a relatively decent margin. 603 horsepower is an awful lot to put through the wheels of an SUV. To give you an idea, it has one more horsepower than a Lamborghini Huracan does. So yes, that's a lot of power to put through an admittedly quite old chassis at this point, because of course the G-Class has been around for several decades now. But surprisingly enough, it doesn't handle terribly. It's okay. It's a little fiddly to get used to. It does want to lean a bit. And when it starts leaning, it will either A, kick the back end out a little bit, or B, just understeer off into a tree. So you do have to sort of be a little bit aware for when it's going to do that. But it's not terrible. Its corners relatively okay. It is very quick. That is certainly for certain. You know, no matter how much it weighs, 603 horsepower is certainly going to get a car a shift on. And this thing certainly gets its shift on. It's probably one of the quickest C-Class cars in terms of straight line speed in the game. Yeah, G-Class nowhere near as bad as you'd probably expect it to be, although I probably still wouldn't recommend it for a racing situation. Next up, BMW X6M, 567 horsepower, 5,185 pounds of weight. Interestingly enough, this is the second most powerful vehicle here today. It's also the second lightest, which on paper should give it a very distinct advantage over the others. The X6, all in all, I don't particularly like the X6. I never have done. It's a very ugly car. Even this redesign, which admittedly is a lot better than the original, I still really don't like the X6. I don't think it really has a point to really exist in this world, to be perfectly honest with you. But how does the X6 actually drive? It's alright. Really, it will understeer. This doesn't handle as good as the X5M does. The X5M, for those of you who haven't heard me speak about it before, the X5M, which hasn't gone around this time, although I'm sure it will do at some point, basically it handles kind of like a Subaru Impreza does, which is very high praise for an SUV. The X6 isn't quite as sharp as the X5 is. It's not a bad car. I will give the X6 that. You know, when it comes to its handling, it isn't terrible. I still probably wouldn't recommend this. I definitely recommend the X5 over the X6. But I have driven worse vehicles, I guess. But for me personally, I wouldn't drive this thing just because of the way it looks. It's hideous. Moving on, Range Rover Supercharged, 510 horsepower, 5,612 pounds of weight. Now, the Range Rover Supercharged, I actually don't mind the modern Range Rovers, believe it or not. I know they're very much Cheshire tractors at this point, but I don't mind them. I don't think they look too bad. I wouldn't own one by any stretch of the imagination, but they're not bad, and this version is particularly cool because it has the Supercharged Jaguar engine in it, which is a nice touch. Admittedly, if you want to compare this to a G65 and the X6, it is a bit outclassed today. You know, it's almost 100 horsepower down on the G-Class, but it's almost got the same weight as the G-Class, and compared to the X6, you know, the X6 weighs almost 500 pounds less, so comparing those to the Range Rover, it is a bit harsh. As far as actually driving characteristics go, the Range Rover drives kind of similar to the X6. Between the X6 and the Range Rover, I would probably take the X6 based on handling alone. Admittedly, if you do want the Range Rover, then you can go for the SVR model, which will go around the track at some point. The SVR is essentially a more focused version of this vehicle, and it'll definitely compete with stuff like the X6M a bit more closely. But as it stands in its stock form, it's not a terrible car to drive. Again, like the other two SUVs though, I wouldn't really use this in a racing situation, but if you're forced into it, you're not completely boned. Next up, Ford F-150 Raptor, 411 horsepower, 6,006 pounds of weight. This is the second heaviest vehicle here today. Awful lot of weight. in the F-150 Raptor. Now, I've got to be honest, I've always been a fan of the F-150 Raptor. I kind of like the silliness of this vehicle. It is an interesting car, actually. Or truck, I guess. Yeah, I do like the F-150 Raptor an awful lot, actually. So, probably one of my favourite trucks. I would... maybe the SRT-10. They're very close in my book. Anyways, onto the way this thing actually drives. The Raptor, it's okay. It's a bit boaty, admittedly, through the corners. It will rock and roll around on that suspension because, well, look at it. You can sort of see it getting its knee in the corners a bit, and you can feel that when you're going around the corners. Admittedly, this is either an E-Class car or a very low D-Class car. So coming from, you know, the Range Rover and the X6 and so on, and jumping into the F-150, it did feel a bit outclassed. Obviously it would do. You know, straight line speed isn't quite there compared to the other vehicles, and the handling also isn't quite there. You know, if you're looking for a racing vehicle, you might want to look more towards the Shelby or the new 2017 Raptor, which haven't gone round yet. But I'd imagine they'd be a little bit better than the standard car is, unfortunately. But, you know, I've never really tried to build one of them for a race, so maybe it's good as a race car. I do doubt it, though. Anyways, next up, the Ram Runner. 390 horsepower, 5,949 pounds of weight. This is, for all intents and purposes, the equivalent to the Raptor. The only difference is, I believe I was reading about this on the internet, this is actually a trim model for Ram 1500 and not its own vehicle like the Raptor is. Anyways, 390 horsepower, 5,949 pounds does mean that the Raptor has the advantage on power, and this has the slight advantage when it comes to weight. The Ram, what's it like to drive? It's lethargic. That's the best way to describe this vehicle. It just feels very lazy. You know, that engine does not want to rev at all. It hates it. You know, the gearbox is a bit meh. In fact, the gearbox is so... the gearbox isn't great, and because of that, you do need to stall start the car. Now, I will quickly explain what I mean by stall starting. Essentially, this is usually... it's more common among turbo cars, but because these vehicles have such long gear ratios, some of them, when I say stall starting, what I mean is if you basically launch the car full throttle, it will hop on the start line and it will stop dead, and then it, you know, will continue. Even if you're not using clutch, it will stall start. I assume if you use clutch, it will actually just stall. So what you actually have to do is you kind of have to get the revs just right and the vehicle will go. Usually the best way I find to do it is hold the vehicles at about 2,000 RPM, and then on the count of 1 just before you go, you mash the throttle pedal and the car will sort of, it will jitter a bit, but it is a quicker way to get the vehicles launched. And I had to do that with the Ram Runner, and indeed this as well. The Hummer H1 Alpha, 300 horsepower, 8,114 pounds of weight. Unsurprisingly, this is the heaviest vehicle here today. In fact, it weighs 2,100 pounds more than that Raptor did. So essentially you could stick one of the, I think a TVR Sagaris weighs about 2,100 pounds, so yeah, it's basically a Raptor with an extra Sagaris on it and with less power. So obviously we weren't expecting the Hummer to break any lap records today. But when it comes to driving, it's not terrible. Certainly it's at the point where the Hummer, you can see it now, it is a slow vehicle. Because it's so slow, you know, it's not, it doesn't quite have enough speed to really make it bad through the corners. You know, some vehicles do, cough cough, Gurkha. God, the Gurkha was awful. This is better than the Gurkha. If you, I don't know why you'd ever have to make this decision, but if you have to choose between the Gurkha and the Hummer to go racing in, you do want to go with the Hummer. Hands down, the Hummer is so much better than the Gurkha. Yeah, the Hummer isn't bad. You know, I almost want to go as far as to say if you threw full race weight reduction and some aero on this vehicle, it could make a somewhat competent race car. Maybe. But as it stands stock, certainly not. It's slow. The gearbox is alright in it. I will certainly give it that. The gearbox is you know, it's relatively short ratioed, which is nice. Unlike the final car today, which has a rubbish gearbox. This is our Jeep Grand Wagoneer, 144 horsepower, 4,499 pounds of weight. That means that this is the lightest vehicle here today. However, it's also the least powerful by an awful long way. In fact, the Hummer has double the horsepower of this, and the G-Class has almost quadruple. Anyways, the Grand Wagoneer, I actually really do like the Grand Wagoneer. It is an interesting little car, or big car actually, I guess. Compared to everything else here today, though, it is a bit little. So yeah, the Wagoneer, how would I describe it? It handles excellently. This thing has superb handling. Yeah, I know, bear with me. It corners flat, it doesn't understeer. This thing could make, and I believe I have made an A-Class build of this before, and it was very successful. These cars are really very good if you stick some upgrades in them. Out of all the cars here today, this is the one I recommend you go and drive, because the Grand Wagoneer, it's fantastic. You know, the Willys Jeep is also very good through the corners, but this is fantastic. The one Achilles heel of this car, I mentioned it a bit just before the lap started, it has the worst gearbox I think I've used in one of these lower powered cars. Basically, it's a 3-speed with stupid long ratios. You do have to stall start it, although stall starting this is actually incredibly difficult because that first gear goes up to about 70 miles per hour, I think. You don't use the third gear in this vehicle. The gearbox is absolutely naff. If you were to swap this thing out with the race gearbox and just the race gearbox, and I might have to do this as a challenge at some point, I can imagine you'd be able to knock 3 seconds out of the laps you can set with this thing. That's how bad the gearbox is. Anyways, moving on to the times today, and the X6M is in fact the quickest vehicle of today, going into 80th with 129.446. Beats out a Shelby Cobra and an Impreza hatchback, which is quite impressive when you consider what car the X6M is. Moving down the board, the G-Class goes into 107th with 131.557. Beats out an Escort RS, a Delta HF Integrale. A little bit slower than a 300ZX. Again, that's a Mercedes G-Class, and that certainly is not a bad time for that car. Moving down some more, Range Rover Supercharged, 116th, 132.385. Finally splits up the E30 and the E28. It's a bit quicker than a Buick Regal Grand National, quicker than a Lancia Stratos, quicker than a Holden Commodore VL, which is pretty impressive. Down the board some more, we find the F-150 Raptor in 161st with 139.712, which beats out an Escort RS 1800, and the Ram Runner is 2 seconds down on that, 163rd, 141.796, quicker than an Opel Kadett. So neither of those cars did terribly. They are on the bottom end of the board though. And speaking of the bottom end of the board, we have to find our last two cars there. Jeep Grand Wagoneer, 173rd, 146.300, beats out a Porsche 356 Speedster. It also beats out a Pontiac Aztek. So the Grand Wagoneer is about where you'd sort of expect it to be. And the Hummer, 176, 149.888. So, yeah, there's not really too much around that car. It's slower than an Aztek. It's about 7 seconds quicker than a Willys Jeep. Nothing really to compare that car to yet, but yeah, the Hummer, some of these cars were certainly at a disadvantage. Anyways, friends, that is it for this episode. Join me next time when we're going to be taking a look at some much faster vehicles, as we're going to start looking at some retro supercars. As always, if you have any suggestions for themes or cars you'd like to see go around the track, leave them down below in the comments. That's it for today, though, friends. Thank you all very much for watching. My name's been the Real Emile. Till next time, farewell.